We'll go ahead and get started. Let's see how many folks we got. We got 16 students. That's good. That's a good start tonight. Well, everybody, welcome back. This is MELS 603 on Wednesday night. This is week 3 of the 10-week session. This week, you were to look at principles tort liability, examine examples of management cues, suggested risk management guidelines, and reflect on the fact that educators have been found financially responsible for professional actions inaction when an injured or adult proved that professional action inaction led to injury. This one kind of piggybacks on last week's about the accident on a field trip. One of the things that many of you found out is that a lot of field trip policies don't have a protocol of what happens if you happen to have an accident or there's some kind of an incident on a field trip. And one of the things that you need to remember is the first thing you do is you call the police. Some folks said, well, would try to assess the injuries of students. The first thing you're going to be asked on the witness stand when you get sued is where you got your medical degree. You need to call the police, and they'll call fire and medic and all those people. You can get all those people there. Because you certainly don't want to have to try to defend yourself in court that you didn't realize that a child was hurt or that you didn't bother to call the police. That's one of those negligence, inactivity. So this week piggybacks. I mean, that's why I had that one last week. So that this week you learned about, that's why he said we have to call the police. We'll get charged with negligence with inactivity. If we don't do something like that. And so that one was for the week. Some of you have already moved ahead in observing due process and school and report. And I think what you're finding is it's a lot more involved than you knew that it was or you thought that it was. And the thing that I want to remind you of is you never know which case is going to end up in court or is going to get appealed to the principal or the superintendent of the board or end up in court. That's the appeals process. The decision you make as an AP can always be appealed to the principal. Principal's decision can be appealed to the superintendent. Superintendent's decision appealed to the board, and the board can that decision can be actually heard in court. And you never know which discipline incident. I mean, can be the most inane thing, but you just don't ever know. And so you have to follow the due process procedure each time. Not just, well, this one's cut and dried, kid admitted it, but then later on they may recant that admission or claim that they were coerced. And so what I hope that you will find out from due process is that it's a lengthy process that must be followed every time. You can't be arbitrary, follow it every now and then. And that's what I hope you will find as you're moving into that one, because we're going to kind of go through, we're going to finish up with court cases tonight and kind of move into some student discipline issues and some liability issues about it in terms of antecedent behaviors. We're going to talk about that later tonight. Let's look at where we are with our evidence artifacts. This past Monday, every task 1 and task 2 were due. This week, we're working on task 3 of the OMA. It'll be due by next Monday, so you should be working on task 3. Please remember the process. I have both Dr. Stedman and Dr. Pickard with me tonight. You put your work in our class shell. I will review it. I may have a comment to add something or do whatever, but if it's not where it needs to be, then I will refer you to them in their clinical internship shell, and they will work to help you. That's what they're there for, and they don't mind. They do a great job. So you don't have to put your work in their shells unless I ask you to. If you want a second opinion from them, that's fine. But there is no requirement that you go to their shell unless I tell you to in our class shell. And a couple of you I have told you need to get some help with this. And I'll send you an email as well. Not only do I put it in Blackboard, I send you an email that you need some help with this. There's too much of it missing for us to work on it on the fly. You're going to have to stop and work with your coach on it. Other than that, you just keep rolling. We don't have time this summer to put an extra step in the process unless we need to. And if we do, we will. We'll put the extra step in with your coach and have you work with them. So,
Dr. Lamb, I will tell you, the students you referred to me, I wanted you to know that they both have reached out to me and I have responded back, and I have been pleased with the additional work that has come in so far.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I know Dr. Pickard, you might want to weigh in. I've referred a couple to him, and they've already got their work in and passed it and moved on.
Yes, sir.
So it doesn't have to take a long time. I mean, these folks will tell you, I tell you what needs to be done when I send it to you. These are the things you're missing, and they work with you quickly. I mean, they'll get right back to you. So it's no shame in that, but we need to make sure that we're getting our work in its entirety and keep moving. And that leads me to my last point on that. Don't send in partial work this summer. We just don't have the time for partial work. Make sure that you've addressed each part of the prompts and each prompt of the task when you send it in. It may need a little bit of work, but if you leave big sections out, you need to just all of our time up. Yours mostly, if you send in partial work just to meet some artificial deadline. You got to pace yourself. We're not going to send out notices. Part of moving to 603 is learning to pace yourself. We have one student, Dr. Stedman and I talked about this week, and she does just the greatest work ever, but she can't pace herself. She spends too much time. She doesn't know when enough is enough. And that's one of the things that it can always be better. And when you get out in the job, you can always do more. It can always be better. But you can't be late with turn-ins and work that's assigned to you by your superintendent. You can't be late with that stuff. Well, you can be a couple times, but then they'll get somebody else and see if they're on time. So following directions and being on time is a big part of school administration. So you just have to know when enough's enough. I've done, this is for the time that I've got, this is the best that I can do and move on. So let's talk about OMA Task 3. In Task 3, you are assessing the master schedule process. So let's look at that. Okay, Task 3 description. Candidates are challenged to implement their findings from the contextual analysis. That's why we had you gather all that stuff. So when you got here, you'd have a picture of your school. By formalizing the assessment of the current schedule into a modified one that will actually be proposed to school administration. Feedback from the actual school administrative team or building principal related to candidate's proposal is the final step in this phase of the OMA internship experience. Working with the building administrator, the candidate will analyze the academic schedule to ensure maximal compliance with a defined set of necessary and required circumstances. All right. You're going to develop an analysis of the existing school schedule to include, but not limited to, an assessment of the current scheduling procedures, strengths and weaknesses, not the schedule itself. We start with the procedure that built the schedule. If you've got a bad schedule, that means you had a bad process that led you to that. So we're looking at the scheduling procedures or process for strengths and weaknesses, alignment with school improvement team, legal requirements, needs of diverse and exceptional populations. That's why we had you find out what you had at your school and what they were supposed to get. Evidence for input from faculty and utilization of findings as a basis for revising the current schedule. Now, so here's an example of one of our classmates. This is Tamara's, and she's done an excellent job. So when she looked at the process first, when asked if federal law is taken into consideration, federal laws, state laws are kept at the forefront. She mentioned they are there to create adequate class time, adequate planning time, required by federal and state mandates, classroom size, Title I, how to use that federal money. All that comes in first. For example, X period where students receive tutoring, that's part of Title I. You're paid to put that in your schedule. If it's not there, then Title I, you've misspent their money. So that federal stuff comes first. And then with regard to Board of Education policy, they take careful consideration in placing incoming sixth graders into the right classes. Board of Education policy is very detailed for incoming middle school students based on their personal experiences, such as Spanish as their first language, just taking ELL classes, to students that have scored high on EOG tests, require advanced classes. Again, that's local. Those are those non-negotiables from your local board that you have to build your schedule around. So as you can see, they started with federal law and state law on all of those planning time and free time and class sizes. Now they've moved to the local board what they want. And then best practices. The principal brings those in, and as well as the school improvement team. They bring in best practices. And then finally, teacher input. And so that's exactly what I'm looking for. And look, it didn't take 2 pages, less than 2 pages, to explain the process of how their schedule's built at their school, and that they start with federal and state. Then they do Board of Education policies, and she gives examples of those. And then best practices, that's from the principal and the school improvement team, basing that best practices for their school on the kind of student that they have and the kind of resources that they have and those kinds of things. And then teacher input. That's what I'm looking for. This is a really good one, and it's simple, and it's right down the line. And she gives an example of how this guides their schedule. And then, of course, then she moves right on into the others. But this one is incredibly good. Assessment of the current schedule. Then she goes right into strengths and weaknesses. That's the next thing on the list. Alignment with school improvement team findings. Alignment with diverse needs and exceptional populations. And she already knows what population she has and what they're supposed to get because she did that analysis in task 1. And then utilization of the findings for a basis of revising the current schedule. And then here's the revised schedule in prompt 2. I mean, how much simpler can it get than that? If you did a good job, you had 2 weeks to do task 1. If you did a good job with task 1, task 2 took 20 minutes. If you did a good job with task 1, this one is really easy to knock out. Students see this one and go, oh my, but you understand, we had you do all the heavy lifting in task 1. That's why we gave you 2 weeks to do it. So if you did a good job in task 1, this one just writes itself. This is a 2 or 3 hour one here. This is not weeks and days here, because you spent the weeks and days on task 1. You do your work up front. The rest of this one is easy. So that's task 3, and of course next week will be task 4. That you just write your competencies. All right. Questions about task 3? How easy that is. It's just right down the line, folks. Can't be any more simple. But hopefully, by the time that we get to task 4 in another week, you will understand, oh, that's how the master schedule is built. That's why they do all these things. It's not random. Those stickies on that gridded board in the principal's office or the conference room, that stuff's not random. There is a process as to how those stickies get on that board, in what order, who's teaching what, where, when, and why. But there's an actual process of how you develop the schedule. Starts with federal law, then state law, board policy, best practices from principal and school improvement team, teacher input. It's built that way. If you build it that way, you will come up with a good schedule. That translates easily into PowerSchool and will generate your school activity report every month, and you will be in compliance with all federal, state, and board policy, laws and board policies. You know this is checked every month. Let me say that again. You know your master schedule is checked every month before your school is given its money, or the district is given the money for your school for average attendance, average daily attendance. They check your master schedule every month for legal compliance, every month. Called the SAR, the School Activity Report. It is filed once a month. And if you're not in compliance, your school doesn't get its money, or the district doesn't get its money for your school that month until you fix it. They check it every month. It's all electronic now. You have to take the schedule that you build on those stickies, has to be then translated and put into PowerSchool. It has to be interpreted into PowerSchool, and it's checked every month before you get your money. So this is, anything that's got money attached to it is very important, and you will lose your job over it if you get it wrong. All right, let me go to 2 questions here. Where can we reference that example? You can reference the directions. You don't need this example. You need to write your own example. If your school is not a Title I school, what federal? You got all your federal programs. EC, 504, limited English proficiency and academically gifted if you don't have Title I. Those are all federal programs. That's why we had you look at those in the first task. All of those are federal programs. Let me reiterate. EC, exceptional children. 504, disadvantaged handicap. Academically gifted. English limited proficiency. Those are all federal programs. And they've got to come first.
Dr. Lamb, and in my district, Indian education is the largest program we have the largest Indian education program anywhere in the United States.
And that's a federal program.
Right.
That's why we told you your special populations. Those are special populations are federal. That's a federal term. You need to find out what special populations are in your school. What federal programs? What programs are paid for by the federal government? It's not just Title I. EC, 504, limited English, academically gifted, Indian education. And there's some other one-offs out there as well that are federal. You were supposed to find out what those were. You don't need this example. You just follow the directions. Just follow the directions. Because yours won't look exactly like this one. When I give out examples, guess what? When I get them back, they look just like the one I gave out. That's an IQ test for me. No, we're not giving out those. But you see how easy it was. She went right down the line. And you got the information. You've already done the work. All right, let me close that one out. All right, so that's where we are with our evidence artifacts. That's where we are with our weekly schedule. Let me get out of that one. We know where we are, what we're doing. All right, let's get to this week's lesson. All right, I want to cover court cases from last week. I want to go through these again quickly. These are the relevant court cases in the modern era of schooling. Again, the modern era of schooling started in 1954 when the Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education, which said separate was not equal, which had been found in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This said, nope, that's not true. It started the modern era of schooling. 11 years later, we had the Civil Rights Act of 65. North Carolina integrated. I was in school at the time, integrated in 66. School consolidation started because we combined two separate two systems of schooling together, so school consolidation started. Also in 1966, North Carolina exited capital funding. Now the local county commissioners, which fund schools, are responsible for capital, which is buildings and the maintenance of those buildings. If you're in one of the 114 districts in North Carolina and 70-something districts in South Carolina, school boards are unempowered. They cannot levy their own taxes. your county commissioners or town commissioners have to give the school board money. And so it's since 1966, it's been the responsibility of the county commissioners or the town commissioners to come up with the money to build schools. The state got out of that business in '66. There was two reasons that they got out of it in '66. The first was they didn't want to be involved in the integration battle. That was number one. But number two, and the real reason why the state of North Carolina got out of building schools in '66 is they started building community colleges. We have in North Carolina 58 community and technical colleges, more than one for every other county, and many of them have multiple campuses. And so the state decided to shift its capital focus from public schools to community college, post-secondary. And so that's why we got out of funding. And so it was left up to the local districts to buy bonds and borrow money and build buildings. They knew that the building of school buildings would continue, but so basically the developers that way, the people that build the buildings double dip. They not only got the money from the locals to build local schools, they got state money to build colleges. And the people that were the movers and shakers in the state at that time were the big builders. The group out of Raleigh and the group out of Charlotte that built all the school buildings. And so there wasn't enough money for the state to do both, and so the state got out of building school buildings and got into building community colleges. They also didn't want to be involved in consolidation. Okay, chat. All right, I've got 26 participants. Somebody Michelle just indicated that some of them hadn't got the link. No, everybody's got the link. Let me go back and let's see. 6. But the two people you just emailed me are not in my class. They wouldn't be getting a link to my class. I mean, I could send them one, but they're in another class. You're just working with them across the work. They're in a different section of classes. They are not in my class. So they would not be getting one. So what I could do, now she's with Dr. Talent. That's her. That's not me. They're with Dr. Talent tonight. I don't know what their problem is, but they wouldn't be getting one from me. Jenny and Lieber wouldn't be getting. They get one from Dr. Talent. All right, back to work here. All right, back to our court cases. So that changed that funding issue changed the shape of schools and changed how they were built and who was in charge, and it put locals in decision-making abilities and widespread use and misuse of funds because it became local. A lot of issues with that over the years with local boards getting in trouble. One of the districts that I worked in, one went to jail. One of the districts that Dr. Stedman has worked in, some of those people have gone to jail over over embezzling the money because it became a county issue and a local issue in towns, funding. And whenever that has happened, there's been a lot of uses and misuses of those monies over the years. That'd be me. That would be me. Okay. And so, so that has made us, I know that when the state ran building schools, there was probably graft and inefficiencies, but it was a whole nother level once we turned it over to 114 different groups to see about building school buildings. That's significant in that we have made the building of school buildings and education, we've taken that from a state responsibility to a local, and that's why we have such disparities and discrepancies across the state, North and South Carolina, where you can go to one district and they have state-of-the-art, up-to-date facilities, and other kids going to school in trailers. That's not a state problem or issue. That's because of the locals. Now, it's up to the locals to decide the conditions that their children go to school in. And so that's why you have so many disparities in conditions for children for schooling. I get that question every semester. Why is it that, the people next door to us, they have all these nice facilities and we don't? Why does the state give them more money than us? The state doesn't. They're willing to tax themselves more to provide better facilities for their students in that county or in that town. There are actually still some city school districts, town school districts left in both states, but not many. But because the local people are willing to tax themselves, that's why their students have better facilities. It's not a state issue. State's not been in it for 50 years now. 52 years the state's been out of building buildings for public schools.
Dr. Lamb.
Yes.
Does the board have anything to do with, like, your school board, the decision on the
They are unempowered.
Ah.
School boards are unempowered. They do not have the ability to levy taxes. They must go hat in hand and present their proposed budget to the county commissioners. And that's not going well. And somebody said, what about a district like CMS? CMS has to go to the county commissioners just like everybody else to get buildings built, money for facilities, have to let bonds. I saw today that they're going to do $33 million worth of work in CMS to do some improvement to some buildings. That money come from the county. They did not come from the state. Again, it's the discrepancies within inside the district. Well, that's winners and losers. See, if the state was doing it, see, that's part of it, the discrepancies within a district. But that's because of the politics of who got voted in and who didn't get voted in, who's empowered in the district. When the state did it, it was pretty much everybody got the same. But as soon as the state got out of facilities, it became different counties. There were winners and losers, but even inside the counties, there are winners and losers now. It's about who. I heard a county commissioner say, well, we're not giving that part of the county any money for schools. They didn't vote for me. That's just the way it works. And so, yes, you have discrepancies, especially larger districts have huge discrepancies because of the constituencies in those communities. They don't vote, or they vote for the wrong people according to the people making decisions. Yeah, that is awful. When I went to work in Charlotte-Mecklenburg a long time ago, I'd already worked half my career elsewhere. But when I went to work there, the first thing I said is I'm not sure that this place is really interested in educating all children at the same level. And I pointed to the best high school and the worst high school and said, there's no way that you can accommodate both of these in the same district if you really cared that everybody got the same or the best that they could get. One was the Taj Mahal, the other was an outhouse. That's just the way it was, and that has not changed. There are still places that, you know, have incredible facilities and others that don't. But that's winners and losers. That's what happens when you get away from a state authority that whose job is to meter out things equally or equitably. You get into the winners and losers part of it. And if you travel around the state and you look at the community colleges, you know, the original community colleges, everybody got the same. But look at what's happened in public school facilities since '66. Nobody gets, you know, a very wide range of facilities out there. But that's due to local politics, not state politics. Yes.
So, I mean, when we're looking at these schools that are in poverty areas and things like that, they're never going to get out of it.
That's correct.
Their people are never going to be able to put money into their schools.
That's correct.
So why do we keep blaming this on test scores when that's obviously has nothing?
Because that's much easier, and it salves our conscience than telling the truth.
That's so sad.
It's easier. I mean, you know, it's one of those we blame the victim kind of thing, and it's easy to see rather than to talk about the disparities that we've created. And that's what we've done.
Good teachers out of those hard districts because they're getting blamed for low test scores.
Sure they are. When you go to a low-performing school, you lose 30 points on your IQ when you walk in the door. We blame the victim. That's what we do. And that's why this notion that of strategic staffing that will move our best and brightest to our worst schools and everything will be okay. No, they're just idiots like the rest of us when they get there.
Yeah.
Because it's you know, the people that they've got are doing the best that they can do. The folks they send in don't do any better. It's the conditions that they're in that cause the outcomes that they get. Okay. Also in 65, we had the Elementary and Secondary Act of 65, which established Titles 1 through 9. You should look at those federal entitlement programs. Title 1, you know, that's reading and math for kids that live in poverty. Title 9 is gender equity. We changed again, you know, another big sea change in public school was 69 Tinker versus Des Moines that said that kids get due process rights. And that's why you have to learn about that and why you have to go and watch it and do all that, because they get due process. And it doesn't matter what they did or didn't do. If they don't get due process, they're let off the hook. And you're held accountable, and rather than the student who perpetrated whatever crime that they perpetrated, because they get due process rights. 71, another big sea change was forced busing for integration. Swan case in Charlotte was the national case. If anybody knows who argued that case before the Supreme Court, you get an extra 100 points. If anybody knows who argued that court, without Googling it now, no Google. If anybody knows who argued that case in front of the Supreme Court, famous North Carolinian that argued that case in front of the Supreme Court. If anybody knows Julius Chambers, I didn't see anybody chime in on that one. He eventually became the president of North Carolina Central University, but he is the attorney that argued that case before the Supreme Court. That said that districts were required to bus students for integration. Education amendments of 72 reconfirmed Titles 1 through 9. 1974, federal funding for the first time said that exceptional children, special education kids, were due a free and appropriate public education. So they started coming to school for the first time with any regularity to do something besides be custodial staff. When I went to school, that's what exceptional children did. They were part of the custodial staff or cleaned up in the lunchroom. In 74, the federal government said you must educate them as well as all the other children. We had another court case in 75, which challenged all the entitlements in the Elementary and Secondary Act of 65. It was upheld in 75. People were still fighting it 10 years later. In '84, the basic education plan was passed in North Carolina. Said every child was entitled to a basic public education, and somebody said, wait, what is a basic public education? So we spent 5 years developing the first standard course of study for the state of North Carolina. By 1989, we had the big white notebooks, if you're old enough to remember those, that said this is what kids are supposed to learn. And somebody said, wait a minute, how do we know if they're learning it or not? So in '89, we started performance-based accountability, which became the state ABCs, which is now the state report card, where we started doing standardized state testing to see if they actually learned the stuff that was in that white notebook. Along the way, we did our first attempt, and one of the first in the United States at differentiating pay for outcomes. It was called the Career Development Pilot Program. You had status 1, 2, and 3 based on the outcomes of your students on standardized test scores. It crashed and burned 5 years in, 4 years in, because nobody wanted to pay for it. It wasn't that it wasn't working. It worked too well. People didn't want to pay. General Assembly didn't want to pay. That's when all the freezes came in and state salaries were frozen for, help me out, Dr. Stedman, was it 4 or 5 years that teacher salaries were frozen? Some of them were actually rolled back. I've muted him.
The year I got my master's degree was when that happened. The same year I got it, and it was 5 years before I ever saw 1 penny increase after I got my first master's.
Yep, that's correct. Salaries were frozen, steps were frozen, advanced degrees were frozen. In some cases, salaries were rolled back. Teachers were rolled back from 10-month contracts to 9 or 11 to 10. They cut months of employment off contracts. They rolled salaries back. They froze everybody. They froze advanced degrees for 5 years.
And you got paid with 3 different color paychecks too. And if you got a certain color paycheck, you didn't know whether you had a job next year or not, because
or next month or not.
Or next month, right?
You used to get it. We had a green, a yellow, and a blue. And they used to actually give you a paycheck. You had to go to the office and get it at the end of the month. It was federal, state, and local funds. And according to which fund your check came out of, it was the color check you got. And if it was a local one, you didn't know if you'd have one next month or not. A lot of federal jobs got cut. My father-in-law lost his job during that time. He was a federal teacher in McDowell County in Marion, and he came into work one day. They laid them all off, all of them. He taught drafting, I believe it was. They just were gone during that time. I mean, it was a tough time. And the Career Development Pilot Program, that was an attempt to pay for performance for teachers, it was just another casualty of that time. And we lost a lot of good teachers through that period of time. Okay, so that's what happened in '84 through '89. Again, in '89, we started performance-based accountability, which became the state ABCs, which became accountability. As you can see there, state report card, integrate into course testing. And then that led us up to Leandro. So the answer to the trivia question is, how did North Carolina and South Carolina get the lottery? The Leandro case. That's how they got the education lottery. Low wealth districts sued the state and said, we want district power equalizing, DPE. What we want you to do is withhold some of the state allotment to the rich districts, make it up with local money, and give us that extra money that you didn't give them, so we all get the same. Well, the case drug on, as you can see, for 5 years. We held out hope that the state was, that the right thing was going to happen. Of course, it didn't. Not only did they not give the low wealth districts more, they started a lottery, which gives basically no money back to public education and hurts the lowest on the economic run the hardest, because they're the one that buy the tickets and the scratch offs and play the lottery. So it basically is a regressive tax on poor people is what the lottery is. Not only did they not get more money for their schools, they lost more of their disposable income. Kind of a double dip on getting the kick in the seat of the pants. But that's what Leandro did.
Dr. Lamb, I want to let them know my first teaching job was in Hope County, where the Leandro case started, and the county where I live and worked for 30-some years, Robinson County, was one of the 5 school systems that sued and won in that case.
Mm-hmm.
So we benefited tremendously because we're such a poor county for those years.
Yeah. But that's how we got the state lottery. We didn't change the state allotment formula. What we did was we put a lottery in and we gave money out in a pork barrel method. And so the people who were the plaintiffs in the case, their district got some of that money, but nobody else. And they only got it for a short period of time.
Right.
And then after that short period of time was over, nobody's getting any to speak of now, because by the time the company that administers it, they get their cut, and the prize money, the winners get their cut, and all the advertising that it takes, and the state gets theirs. There really isn't any money left except for just a few pork barrel projects here and there, and some of them are just ridiculously bad in terms of being partisan. One of the counties that borders Virginia, they got a commercial where it wasn't on but for about one time because there was such an uproar about. They had the superintendent on. He was thanking the General Assembly for the lottery because they were able to build a new cafeteria so that all 300 of their students at the school could eat at the same time. We're like, you built a whole new cafeteria for a school that only had 300 students that needed to be closed and consolidated. Why didn't you just throw that money out the window of a moving car? It would have done the same amount of good. So that commercial didn't stay on but a couple of times, but some people recorded it and still show that to show that the inanity, I mean, of how little that money is actually available and how it's been wasted. They paid off the plaintiffs a little bit, and that was the end of that. And so we still have the same funding formula that we always have, but now we have the lottery, which is a pox on our house, I'm afraid, especially in poor communities. So that's how we got it, was the Leandro case. Then, 30 years after Swan, we had the case in Charlotte. It had to be in Charlotte because that's where the original case was. We had a fellow come from across the country and took up residence in Charlotte for a specific reason to challenge the Swan case. He was paid by political parties to do that, and he challenged the Swan case. And it was reversed 30 years later in 2001, no more busing. Not only that, if schools resegregated, the state and the school district had no obligation to fix the resegregation that happened. And folks said that within, busing had happened for 30 years, and folks were predicting that within 10 years we'd be back to the same level of segregation that before the 30 years had passed. They were wrong. It took about 3 months, not 10 years. In about 3 months, seriously, the board went in and redid how they did people assignment, and within 3 months of this decision, schools were as segregated as they'd ever been. Not 10 years, 3 months. So when the next school year opened after that spring, we were right back where we'd been 30 years ago, which was another blow for equity and equality. Nationally, in 2001, No Child Left Behind, which said you can't have low-performing schools or you can't have persistently dangerous schools. The persistently dangerous will get you before the low-performing, and we'll talk about that in subsequent classes. That's acts of crime and violence. When too many of those occur on your campus, either your school gets reconstituted or students get to go to the school of their choice in your district. They get bussed away from your school. It also said that states had to put a plan in place for teacher retention. And North Carolina put the teacher working conditions survey in. South Carolina, it's the advanced ed survey. Folks think, well, the state really must care about teachers. They're doing these surveys about their job satisfaction and their working conditions. And they might, but that's not the reason why we have the advanced ed survey and the teacher working conditions survey in our 2 states. We have it because federal law says you have to have it. It's an attempt at teacher retention. It's mandated. It's not. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. Don't ever think that part. It's straight from No Child Left Behind. Also has guidelines for teacher certification and teaching out of field, and also has guidelines for highly qualified. Every class, every child is supposed to have a highly qualified teacher in their classroom, which means no more old B licenses. You folks never even heard of that. That went out before many of you were even born. When Dr. Pickard and Stedman and I first started, there used to be such a thing as a B license. That was folks who were not highly qualified. And you're not allowed to use them anymore.
But they didn't make as much money as an A licensed person.
No, they didn't. But it's a shame that the federal government in 2001 had to stop states from doing that in order to be the cheapskates that they were from saving money, hiring people and giving them a B license that didn't have college degrees, never student taught, and putting them in classes with kids. They would do that and pay them out of local funds, that different color check we were talking about. They didn't want to pay certified teachers that made state rate. So they would hire folks, put them on a B license, and pay them about half what you paid regular teachers, and just regularly put them in classrooms with kids.
And this is before the day of background checks too, I think, Dr. Lane.
That's correct. So all the local folks that ne'er-do-wells that needed a job, the local would hire them, pay them out of local funds, put them on a B license, and turn them loose with children. And it's a shame that it took until 2001 for the federal government to say you have to stop that. 2001 before we stopped that practice. I mean, that's kind of like from horse and buggy days. You would think that would have never seen the light of day after 1954, but it was only stopped, and it would still be going on today. It actually is still going on today. We just call it, but it's mostly done in charters and privates now, that we hire local people with less than ideal credentials. In some of those places, some of them do a really good job, but they don't have the same. They're allowed to basically hire people on B licenses in those schools today. Public schools are not. I mean, traditional public schools. I know charter schools are public schools. Some charter school corporations follow the same licensing and requirements and pay as state schools. Some don't. Private schools, some do and some don't. But it's up to their own discretion as to whether they want to. Traditional public schools are now mandated by federal law that you will hire a certificate people highly qualified, and you will pay them the standard rate. Privates and charters do not have to do that. And so, again, that leads to some of those abuses that we see. Isn't the lateral entry program going away? In its current iteration, but it will never go away because we can't get enough people through traditional methods. At one time in the 1970s, I'm sitting here in Craig Hall, the education building at Gardner-Webb University in the 1970s, when there was about 2,000 undergraduates here. In any particular spring, there would be 200 students or more student teaching. I said that correctly. 200 or more student teaching out of the 2,000 population. There's probably 500 in the senior class. Of those, 200 would be student teaching in the spring. You know how many student teachers we had this spring? That would be 11, a 1 and a 1. I was at their pinning ceremony. I met and shook hands with each and every one of them. There was 11 of them this spring. And most of them were not traditional in terms of elementary or middle. They were, 2 of them were ESL, 3 were music. We only had 6 that were traditional classroom teachers of the 11. And this was one of the largest private teacher education colleges in the state, as little as 30 years ago, and now we have 11. In the fall, I think we have 4 slated to student teach in the fall. So even if something happens to lateral entry in this current iteration, we're still going to have to let folks in that have a college degree and find some way to license them. They just aren't out there. just like for us, it costs $47,000 a year to come to school here. It doesn't make sense to spend $47,000 to train for a $35,000 a year job. Can't make the numbers work out. 2010, all across the nation, North and South Carolina included, we started the value-added model. SAS Institute out of the Research Triangle in Raleigh is the national leader on that. EVOS is a regression equation that tells us how much, based on the demographics of a particular kid, his dependent variables, tells us what score he needs to make to show a year's growth, and that's how we're now moving from a comparative accountability model to a growth model where the kid is only compared against himself. So that's where we are. We're also using PowerSchool to track this, and PowerSource are your teacher evaluation methods. So now half of teacher evaluations come from kids' performance and half come from the evaluation model. Now, that's adjusted some in some districts, but that's the goal, is to have it 50-50. Then 13, 14, vouchers for low wealth kids plus charter school expansion, elimination of master's pay and career status for teachers. Contrary to what politicians would tell you, elimination of career status was not about getting rid of bad teachers. It was easy to get rid of bad teachers if you wanted to before. Elimination of career status takes away your job right, and what that means is Dr. Stedman and I go apply for jobs. Dr. Stedman, what did you teach in the real world?
I was a middle grade teacher.
All right.
I taught language arts and social studies.
Yep. So I was a chemistry and physics teacher in high school. We go apply for a job without career status. If we go to a private school or if we go to a charter school, they can differentiate and pay me more because I'm rare as hen's teeth.
Right.
We can. So that model now is being coveted by public schools. The elimination of career status is that they would like to differentiate pay and benefits as well. If you're a PE teacher, you're going to be paid as a teacher assistant before long, and you're not going to have any benefits. Get people in lateral entry and pay them less. You'd have to pay me as a chemistry and physics teacher. You'd have to pay me the going rate plus all full benefits. But somebody who's not in a high demand area. So the getting rid of career status was about being able to differentiate pay like charters and privates do. The state very much covets that. And so that's what elimination of career status was about. It was never about getting rid of bad teachers. They got rid of master's pay. They want to pay less. They want to pay less and get more. I saw tonight breaking news: the town of Matthews is going to be able to start its own charter school. So charter schools is a growing population. There's nothing wrong with charter schools as a group, just like there's nothing wrong with public schools. There's good ones and bad ones in both. But that's where we're shifting our impetus. And many of the things that we're doing in public schools now mirror private charters because we're interested in cutting our payroll. We want to spend less money on education and more money on prisons, it seems like. One more question here. Yes. So Matthews is getting its own. So that's kind of the history of federal and state, a little bit of South Carolina in there. I got to be careful not to put too much South Carolina in. But kind of the history of where we are and why we're here. Reactive versus proactive, I agree with that. But that's kind of what shapes our world in terms of law and finance that we're covering this semester. Knowing this is what shapes the parameters of where we're going to go this semester. Okay. Now, I covered the state law on what the principal is supposed to do, and here it is. We've already covered that. This is the corollary for that. Ethics in the school executive. These are the ethical laws that you must follow as well. Now, the state law is 115C 288, but there is a code of ethics that's expected of you to be a school administrator in North and South Carolina. And people say, well, what is that? I have written it out for you. It's right here. This is your ethics in the school. This is when they talk about that you get non-renewed or you get fired or whatever, for conduct unbecoming or ethical issues. This is what this is the part in your contract, the morals clause, the ethics clause in your contract that's not really spelled out. It just basically, it's in there that there's an ethics clause in your contract, and you don't really know what that means, and you're afraid that they can get you on it any time that they want you. I have spelled it out for you. This is the actual expression of the ethics clause that would be in your contract, right here. And it's lesson plan role, the principal for week 3. I have added it to the legal requirements that you have to fulfill. I've also added the ethical requirements that are written into your contract as well. Right here they are. So if you want to know, that's where they are. Last thing tonight, in 2011, I know that seems like a long time ago for you folks. I was the keynote at the big one in Curry, the big state conference at Curry one year. That was 2011. And I was asked by DPI to present that year about identification of antecedent behaviors. And this is kind of the conclusion of this work, this week's, this notion of foreseeability and negligence because of inaction. The idea here is little things become big things, and if you're negligent and don't stop the little things, then the big things tend to pop up, and that's when you get sued. And folks can show that you took no action at the lower levels. You can lose in court because of inactivity. That's part of that negligence statute that we looked at this week in our reading and that we looked at in our case study, negligence, inactivity. And one of the areas where you get dinged on inactivity is you let too many little things go on in your building, and then they become big things, and then they get you for negligence in terms of inactivity. This is a program that I put together for principals across the state. Identification of antecedent behaviors, development of prevention strategies to assist schools in decreasing violent acts on their campuses. Again, if you'll address the little stuff and you have active programs in place to address the little stuff, if the big things happen, hopefully fewer big things will happen. But if you have these strategies in place when they do, when you get sued, you won't lose when you go to court. They won't get you for willful negligence. If you can show, well, I had gang prevention, I had bullying prevention, I had cyberbullying prevention, I had sexual misbehavior prevention, I had all these things in place. We dinged this many kids in terms of gave them consequences for these lower level behaviors that we know are going to become bigger behaviors. We can show that we were working on the small stuff. And so you can't hold us accountable that big stuff happened. That's the notion here. This is modern schooling, though, folks. We were a little ahead of our time in 2011 with this, but we're not now. This is here now. Now you're going to get dinged for things that you didn't do in terms of negligence, especially in the area of kids getting hurt, bullying, cyberbullying, violent acts, those kinds of things. And so you should take a look at this slideshow that I put together, and specifically these are the 4 areas that you're trying to address to stop it at the lower level before it gets to the bigger level. That's the whole notion of antecedent behaviors. And if you can show that you had that you were working towards stopping these. When you have a school shooting or you have a rape or a sexual assault or somebody hurt with a weapon and you get sued, you can defend yourself. And then the last thing tonight, I don't have to go through these. Everybody's required to have a separate school bullying prevention program. Here's an example of what they're talking about. Again, if you've got these things in place, I'm not telling you that it will stop the bad things from happening in your school. I'm telling you, you won't lose your house if they do happen when you get sued. That's the notion here. So this is a couple of examples of things that would be illustrative for you and would also be hopefully educational to prevent that from happening for you guys, because you can be held liable financially for things that go wrong in your building. You need to understand that. And you need to take the appropriate steps, A, because they're the right thing to do, and B, to protect yourself and your family. I see my time is up. What questions do you have for me? Dr. Stedman?
No, just my students. If you need me, you know how to reach out to me.
Okay. Dr. Pickard?
I'm gonna ditto that. I think everybody knows they've got my cell and home number if they need me for anything. We're here for them.
We're here. The work's rolling right in. I've been grading right along. I hadn't missed a day yet. Most days it's twice a day. So we're rolling right along. So if you need extra help, do not hesitate to go to your coach. If I give you feedback to keep moving on, you do not have to, and you just keep moving right along. Don't let us slow you down. You should be to task 3. When I went over tonight, if you'll just follow the directions like she did, it's an excellent one. I don't want to post her work without her permission, but I don't think you need it anyway. I think you need to look at what you did and just follow the prompt and move on. All right. Anybody have anything for the good of the group before we start? Katie, you smiled all night. You made my day, or my evening. It's always
And
nice.
I've watched her. She has a beautiful smile.
That's been the most pleasant thing, hadn't it? Just smile, just like I was making good sense, wasn't it? She was just humoring me. I know. I don't blame her.
And
You
Dr.
don't give me an A, I'll do it.
And Dr. Pickard, she was right above you, so you know who I looked at the most.
Well, she was probably smiling at me. You know, that's why she's smiling. She's just looking at me. She's smiling.
Smiling right along. And no, Miranda's been with us all night. Thank you all for sharing with us tonight and being with us. And there's Carrie. We'll see you all next week. Hope you have a good week. If you need us, holler. We're here. All right. Good night, everybody.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.